Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Um, just want to introduce myself real quick. I am one of the customer advisors over at Amazon Business, and we are very lucky to have Vincent Moorhead with us from Success Academy. He is the head of strategic procurement and supply chain at the network. And Vince, I'm going to kick it over to you to do a little bit of an intro for yourself.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks, Morgan. Thanks for having me. Once again, my name is Vincent Moorhead. I lead procurement at Success Academies. Um, you know, uh, Amazing charter school system here in New York City. Very happy and privileged to be here as they're serving minorities, throughout the city. So my background, I'm actually, my entire background is in procurement. Started out in the government, working for the FBI. I've done construction procurement, and then also manufacturing procurement at a big company called Raytheon Technologies now, or it was formerly called United Technologies. But then my experience took me into consulting, where I would actually build procurement organizations for different companies at A.T. Kearney. And that's what brought me here to Success, as they wanted to build out a full procurement function.
Excellent. So it sounds like you pretty much have worked in every industry. I think the only one you haven't mentioned right now is healthcare. Is that on the horizon maybe after Success?
Hey, I worked for a couple of clients. I just, can't really say their names.
Excellent. Well, thanks for providing some background. And we're very lucky to have you just because of the extensive work you've done at Success and how you've transformed a lot of their procurement practices. So I think first, though, why don't you give a little background, a little more background on Success Academy?
Yeah, so Success, here at Success, we operate 47. The number, depends on if you want to say physical location versus school, but 47 schools throughout New York City. The Our CEO, Eva Moskowitz, she started with just wanting to have equal education for people within New York City. So a lot of our scholars are from low minority income families, and they're basically receiving high quality educations. If you were to look at Success and compare us to some of our peers, our household medium income is much less than maybe in the $50,000 range. Whereas if you were to compare to some of our competitors, their household medium income is somewhere in the 250, and we're outperforming them when it comes to test scores. So it's huge success stories with scholars going. 100% of our scholars just went to college, were admitted into college. Um, they're all testing off the charts when it comes to math and science. And just personally for me, this is something that hit home. I actually went to Brooklyn Tech when I was in New York, but I didn't have options, right? So this is something where you can see that Success is a viable option for students throughout New York City.
Excellent. And tell us a little bit about the facilities that you're operating in.
Yeah, so we we are public charter schools, so we actually get a lot of our spaces from the DOE. A majority, actually, all but one of our spaces right now are DOE provided spaces where we are co-located in some of them with other public schools or co-located with other of our schools or charter schools. And then we have one privately owned location where we just operate through a residential lease.
Excellent. I want to dig a
Mm.
little bit more into some of those challenges you run into, because I
Mm.
think when you're working in shared spaces, it can also influence your procurement policy or practices as well. But before we dive into that, I think it's a good idea for us to kind of level set. When we talk about ambiguous terms like digital procurement, I'm sure in your experience, you throw out that term and can get 5 definitions from 5 different people, right?
Yeah.
So I think what we're curious in learning is, what is your definition of a phrase like digital procurement?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a really good point. Everyone is going to think about it differently, especially depending on how sophisticated, your organization is. Um, but, my definition of digital procurement really goes around ease of use and accessibility to data. So, when I think of digital procurement, I'm thinking about automation and all of the different steps as far as for making requests, making the purchase, processing invoices, and receiving, tracking information and things like that. So if you can automate those pieces, you most likely will also have data, a lot of enriched data that you'll be receiving, which helps complete the loop where you can now do analytics and things like that. So that's when those aspects together make, a digital procurement in my mind.
Excellent. So when you're talking about data and analytics, what specific things come to mind for you in terms of when you're looking at digital procurement?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give you a real life example. So a lot of organizations may have where they might have a purchasing system on the front end where you can send a purchase order to or a request to a supplier. But there may be a disconnect where once the invoices come back in, you're just receiving the information off the invoice. A lot of the time that invoice may consolidate information and you don't know things like items, quantities, and a bunch of that other information. So it just gets booked in your general ledger as an amount. In a digital procurement, you would actually have, if you're trying to transform your digital procurement, you would want that information of items, parts, categories. So this way, when you actually run reports, you can do something and go a little deeper to say, instead of, okay, I buy this much money from the supplier, I can actually say, I bought these items and it looks like this is something that I'm using across multiple schools. This might be an item that I want to standardize because it's a favorite, right? Like 60% of my schools are using this, right? You need the details of the data in order to be able to do that.
And then, so using that example there, let's take it just a step further. And why is that insight important to you, that standardization?
Yeah, so the easiest way that I always attack this is you don't want to negotiate with the world, right? Like you have to think about and really, pick and choose your battles, right? So having the data behind what items make up a majority of your spend or what are high quantity items, understanding what suppliers can provide that to you makes it where now you can have a very pointed conversation with your suppliers to say, hey, I know that we buy 20 different types of pens from you, but I'd like to, bring it down to 3. And then can we now have price breaks based off of that? But you would need to know what you're buying in order to really streamline those conversations.
Okay. I am curious. So when you're having that, let's use that pens example even. Is there an internal cost savings that you get from standardizing some of your specific items outside of just the actual negotiated price with the vendor?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of additional business processes that are completely lost, especially if they don't affect you. Right. So AP processing is a huge one that is often overlooked. It costs a lot to maintain a very vast supply base. You have to interact with these suppliers, and if they're not on automated payments, you actually have physical interaction happening to try to do resolution of invoices and payments and everything, and that actually takes time and labor. So that's one example.
Okay.
Another example would be just managing the supply base as a procurement professional, right? It's hard to manage, 1,000 suppliers, right? Like, when's the last time that, you work for big companies? They're like, oh, I have like, 3,000-4,000 suppliers or 10,000 suppliers. And it's like, when's the last time you really talked to all of these guys, right? So being able to really focus on what are some of the key suppliers and how can you use them as much as possible. And then you get to build off of an already strong relationship. And these are some of the aspects that I've been, working at here, where once you can have that relationship, the next step is, okay, well, how can we grow together? What are some of the things that you can bring from the market so to help me understand something better, which would give me better efficiencies, right? Morgan, we actually do some of this stuff all the time, right? Where, we're talking about, we may buy, I think one of the things we just bought were art kits, right?
Hmm.
Going through the pandemic, trying to understand, how can we keep our scholars engaged? And it was a really nice thing that, I actually know the person that was behind the art kits, Heather. She does an amazing job of what she did. But she wanted to, we had the challenge of, okay, well, how do we deliver these art kits to individual homes, right? If I was using multiple suppliers, that would be a nightmare, right? But we were actually able to, work with you and not only place an order for an art kit that had multiple types of items within the kit, right? Instead of having to buy those items from individual suppliers, we could also then have one shipment that goes to a family because shipping costs can often be overlooked. But the ease of use of just having one shipment and they open up, they see one kit, right? Like
Hmm.
all of those aspects are often overlooked, but um, they're essential with actually making the process smoother, right?
Excellent. And I am curious. I want to kind of back. Sorry,
Yeah.
I am a very curious individual, and you're going to hear me say it a lot for those of you attending.
Awesome.
Um, but to back up just a little bit, what,
Mm.
in your experience working in all the different industries that you've touched, what is the range, the internal cost of managing a supplier, or for each
Oh,
supplier, I would say?
that's a really good question. And I'm sorry, I won't have a direct answer for you. I'm going to tell you up front. And the reason is because it depends on the types of products that the company buys, right? So I've worked in heavy service areas where you're buying, when you're buying services, some of that interaction with your suppliers might be a little bit, sometimes it can be easier because you're outsourcing work to them and you're using them basically as an addition to your company. So you don't have to manage them. You can, the way that you manage them is a little differently
Hmm.
because it's almost like they're tied to like your success type thing. Right.
Gotcha.
Whereas in heavy manufacturing, the amount of, you know, hands-on that you might have to do could be unreal, right? Like I used to have to source, I helped with sourcing castings for airplane engines. It would be like the casting that they would then go and then cut and make the airplane engines. I literally had to work with them on like raw materials coming in, the yields of like, okay, well, you make a casting, you cut it, and only like 10% of the time when you do this is it coming through correctly. So I'm doing like supplier development on their shop floor with them as a supplier, right? So it's such a wide range. But you know, here at Success, I mean, fortunately, we're not making castings and things like that, so it's not that complicated. Educating students are complicated, but I'm not in that space. Here, we're buying a lot of commercial products. We're buying, a lot of SaaS products and things that are, not as much custom. I'm trying to get us out as custom as much as possible. So we this is kind of where a lot of companies sit, kind of in this space, where they're buying things that are not all like super development based, and or a large majority of their spend may be something similar to this, to commercial products as well as like indirect products, which are common, like buying cell phones from Verizon or T-Mobile or something like that, which is common stuff. Right. So that's
Excellent.
why I was saying it's a wide range. And I have seen where at manufacturing, the supply, United Technologies, their supply chain at the time when I was there, they had 40,000 people that worked the supply chain.
Oh, wow.
Right. Right. So it was a lot of people like hands-on doing all different types, parts of delivery assurance, quality, all types of things to help with that supply chain. Whereas, there may be some companies that can have low overhead because they're outsourcing a lot of work. They're using contract manufacturing, so they don't need to do it internal. Um, I worked for one of my customers made electric meters that you would see with like Con Ed and things like that. They had a couple of engineers, and that was it, right? Like because most of it was outsourced.
Gotcha. So,
Mhm.
but I think it's safe to assume, though, the more vendors you have in your system, though, of course, the higher your internal cost of managing those vendors then.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's um, you know, you if you if you have thousands of suppliers that at one point in time, even if you have one issue with each one of them, the manpower to just try to reconcile an issue is a lot, right? Um, and that's also why, all companies do things like work with major distributors, right? Or, Amazon, for example, you're a marketplace, you already connect to multiple suppliers, right? The benefit as a company is that we can use the things that you have in place to not have to deal with issues with that supplier, right? We go to one person if there's an issue with anyone we buy from you for, right? Um, I do think that there is a benefit with that.
Awesome. So let's
Mm.
go ahead and just transition a little bit. And also feel free for any of the attendees to please, if you have questions for anything that we cover, throw it into the Q&A. And we want to make sure we address those questions and give Vince the opportunity to answer your questions. But I think it's a good segue to transition in, and you've been at Success for now a little over 2 years, correct?
Yes, yeah, about 2.5
So
years.
let's talk about your journey of when you got there
Yeah,
to where you are right now.
yeah, yeah, no, definitely. So, I mean, success in my mind, when I first got here, it was in existence for about 13, 14 years, right? And imagine, they started with one school. So, imagine a small business that grows up to be a medium-sized business. It's going to have a lot of processes in place from when it was a small business, right? So, this is just, and this is normal, right? All businesses go through these type of phases. So when I first got here, the team focused on just providing items that went into a classroom to help make sure that first day of school they had what they needed. A lot of books, curriculum, furniture, what we call instructional resources, but imagine like anything else that a scholar needs, like maps or things like that to help learn. And they really focused on buying, purchasing, doing all of the logistics to get it into a classroom, and then making sure that they had it for first day. The team may once in a while help with other initiatives, but it was never like dedicated to doing that. So when then they opened up this position, they hired me, and what they wanted to do was build out a centralized procurement organization, right? They understood that there was so many different aspects of the business that were not procurement wasn't involved in helping out. A prime one being technology, for example, which is one that I've been working on over the last year and a half really extensively. But the idea being that they had different functional teams that were all doing the purchasing, just making sure that the business ran, but wanted to be able to build in some of the procurement expertise into that. So that was the initial thought with the journey. So it's like, I get here and it's like, okay, I'm going to expand out and try to support as much as possible. And then look at some of the processes and immediately was like, okay, wait, slow down. Let's actually fix some of the processes first, right? So one of the first things we did was we implemented a new purchasing system. At a high level, the system that we had before, you could you could put in a request, route approvals, and then once that was approved, it created a purchase order that you had to go into the system, download, and then email to a supplier, right? So that system was completely self-contained. Then once the PO went to a supplier, you would receive an invoice. The invoice would be processed. Every invoice was processed by accounts payable. I'm going to repeat that. Every invoice was processed by accounts payable on the way in.
And
so just imagine.
How many invoices was that usually, though?
So it was tens of thousands, maybe even higher, right?
Of manual entry.
Manual entry. And
Okay.
and this is to make sure that they process the invoice. Let me take a step back. It was a lot of invoices, but there was also more credit card usage, and the credit card usage would be expense reports, reconciliation, right? So together, it was just tens of thousands.
And so I kind of want to split off there for a second and ask about, and what are challenges? What challenges does an organization like Success have when you have a lot of credit card transactions coming through?
Yeah, so Credit cards in general are just something that you have to have like a lot of controls in place to for purchasing. And we made, just like any other small business to a medium-sized business, made good improvements there as well, right? So before there was at least in place a really good approval process. People know that they had to ask for approval before they went out to do purchases. But what would happen is it created a lot of volume of doing expense reports, and the expense report process itself was paper based.
Oh,
Right. So you would go and submit a expense report. Let's say if you buy 10 items from Amazon, right? The way you get invoiced, the way you get expensed is every delivery, right?
oh,
So you could get like 20 different things that you need to go and expense. And then those were individual expense, like individual lease receipts on an expense report that had to be manually entered by accounts payable
and
into our
was
general
there?
ledger.
And so you even, it sounds like there was double effort for the same credit card. You had the person or had to prepare their report, and
Yeah.
then also your team to expense it. I
Yeah.
want to pause just for a second. It looks like Crystal has a question from the audience for you, Vince.
Hi, everybody. Okay, a couple of questions for the audience that are pretty relevant to the topic we're talking about right now.
Mhm.
A couple of people would like to know, Vince, if you are able to share the procure to pay or source to pay system that you chose to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a big proponent of them. So we, just to kind of continue that conversation, we had all of those manual processes that had breaks where the information wasn't flowing directly from system to system. So the new system that we wanted was something that was completely user friendly and would have data flow from beginning to end. So we chose Coupa, right?
Wonderful.
So what we liked about Coupa was, like most new P2P systems, you can go from a request to an invoice. You can do credit card expense reconciliation all within the system. One of the added features that I wanted with Coupa was also a punch out feature. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit, but we definitely chose Coupa. Huge proponent for our needs here. I think it fits very well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Were there any other questions?
There are a few other questions. Are you able to share how many people are a part of your procurement team for success?
Yes.
And how are those roles divided?
Okay. So there are 6 people on my team. And what I wanted to do was I reshuffled the team to really focus on our school related items, which would be our quote unquote direct in the procurement world. And then some of the indirect categories like technology software or technology hardware. So the way that my team is structured is right now, I have openings. So that's why I'm hesitating. But I have
So if anybody's interested, send your resume over to Vince, right? Is
oh
that
yes,
the
absolutely.
plug right there, Vince?
Yes, if you're
Get 'em up on
interested,
LinkedIn.
contact me at right. But I have someone that helps lead all of the school facing side, which covers like books, curriculum, instructional resources, because they have the same stakeholders. They work with academics to basically buy everything for the curriculum. Then on the indirect side, the only one that kind of crosses over a little bit is furniture, because furniture is such a big piece of our school design. So I have someone that manages furniture, but then also some other indirect categories like printing, copying, and things like that. And then I have someone that helps manage technology. And underneath them, each one of them has a direct report, right? But that's at my team level. There's also responsibility at the school level where they support procurement activity. So each one of our schools has a local operations team, which is comprised of a business operations manager, and they may have like 1 or 2 operations associates. If there are purchases that go through the school, they help manage that process with the rest of the school. So we basically train them, and they're an extension, kind of like dotted line. Okay.
Wonderful. And I think last question for now, and we'll let you guys get back to your conversation. Vince, are you able to share what percentage of your supplies you believe are purchased through Amazon Business today?
Oh, good question. I think that so it varies. And the reason it varies is because with Amazon, it's most likely, first off, it's the easiest thing for our employees to find, right? Like if they need something, they can go onto your website, click a link, especially where they were set up in Coupa. We have it where we can go into Coupa, click a link, and then right on Amazon. They shop like normal. And then the items come back into a shopping cart and get purchased within Coupa, right? So that's the punch out feature. So over the last year, we have seen where I would say, if I had to give a percentage, it's actually not that high because some of the other stuff that we buy is like really consolidated. But I would say, maybe like 5%, maybe something like that would be through Amazon. But as far as for like of the supplies, I mean, that's probably like of like everything we buy, but of supplies is probably, 20%, something like that. If I would have to make up a number of just the supplies.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. I will go back behind camera now, and I'll be back soon, I'm sure.
All right.
And
Thank you.
please continue to ask questions, and Crystal will be popping in from time to time to direct those over to Vince.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about, so you're talking about the status of things when you came in, and you've already mentioned that you went over with Coupa. I think what would be interesting to speak on is what were some specific barriers to change that you ran into?
Yes. So after evaluating how things were purchased at the schools, there were some very specific things that I wanted to change. One was that, imagine you're a teacher. First off, you don't know purchasing systems, right? Like this isn't, this, and I don't want you to have to learn that, right? Like I want you to focus on the classroom. But I wanted to make it where instead of you as a teacher having to like, how do you make sure that you have everything you need and that it's not a complicated process, right? So at the beginning, what they would do is we had basically one system that they can go in and request items. Then we use our messaging system between people. Our local operations teams would just receive emails, messages, text messages like, hey, I need these items. They might bump into them in the hallway, like, hey, I need this. And I was like, no, like we need to streamline how requests are made, right? And one of the biggest things that I did, which was not typical of what I've seen in other organizations, was instead of having a central buying team that only had access to the purchasing system, I wanted to make sure that every employee had access. And every employee can go into Coupa and request an item, right? So I'm being very particular with the words. They can say, I need this. Now at a school, imagine two teachers, they both need pens, they go in and they make the request. That gets routed now to the school operations and they can approve or reject, right? So they can say, yep, I approve this, and it comes to the school. They manage the logistics of getting the shipments to each one of the teachers, or in the pandemic, they can actually make sure that their home addresses are there and they ship them directly to their homes. Or they could, option two, they're back in the schools and they say, no, reject, because we have pens in this closet down the hall. You don't need these, right? Like, so they get to manage it that way.
So the school operations managers, how do they get that notification from Coupa? Do they send it? Is it an email?
Yeah. So another thing I like about Coupa is that it's as automated as you can think.
Okay.
There's literally an app they can have where an app notification pops up that says you need to approve something. There's emails, and you can actually action right into the email. So you'll receive an email and you'll read the description. It tells you all the information. If you want to approve, you just click approve and it sends an email back, and then it goes back to Coupa and approves the purchase.
Excellent.
Um,
And I'm curious with that, if let's just say you and I are teachers, we both submit the same item, what is that notification like? How does the operations manager decide, like, does one order get fulfilled, or what's
well,
the messaging to the requisitioner look like?
yeah, got it. So as far as so this, we put in place the system that will allow them to approve or reject based off of understanding they need to look at their inventory, see if they need the order, and then they can approve or reject. But we already have systems in place. When I use the word systems as in what broadly, like school systems in place, where if a teacher needs something, they know who to go to
Mhm.
and they know the kind of message that they'll get back, right? So Coupa allows where they can actually reply in the request to say, hey, we have this down the hall, and they can reply. Or they can do some of the other things that they do for trainings and stuff like that. They're used to just reaching out to the teachers anyway, and they can just email them, call them, hey, look, this is up the hall. Or they might even be able to go up the hall, grab it, and say, hey, I saw that you requested this. Here it goes. Right? They can manage that at the school level. But Coupa does allow a way to make comments. So this way, when something's approved or rejected, you can actually say why. And actually, we've required that if you reject anything, that you have to provide a comment. We've defaulted that in our system.
And one thing you've talked about before, I know that your inventory system now. Can you speak a little bit about how Coupa helps with that?
Right. So, being transparent, inventory is a tough one,
Mhm.
right? Inventory at other companies is going to be very straightforward. But when you're buying things and using like the financial term, the moment that's a lot of the stuff we buy, the moment that it hits school, it's expensed, right? Like if you're buying paper, it's not like you're going to keep count or inventory of the paper, right? So what we've done is created systems outside of Coupa where they do keep inventory and they'll manage to an inventory level within like what they call like a teacher workroom is a term that we use, or TWR. They'll walk through the TWR and say, okay, it looks like I'm running low on X, Y, and Z. Let me place an order and replenish. All right. But that Coupa, the way that we've implemented Coupa doesn't help as much with the inventory, right? So Coupa does have inventory modules and things. We didn't decide to use that. And then for bigger items like furniture and things like that, we just created a warehouse within Coupa as a supplier. And that's the way that we help manage some of that other stuff. So if you're at a school and a chair breaks, you go and make a request to SA Warehouse. That goes to our warehouse vendor, and then we figure out getting you the replacement chair. Okay.
So let's talk about after, since we're about 12:35 in, want to be cognizant of everyone's time,
Yeah.
but I'm curious if you could spend some time talking about what were some of the outcomes that you've seen since you effectively digitized the procurement process at Success.
Yeah. One of the first things that we saw and that we actually targeted were there were certain suppliers that we interacted with a lot, Amazon being one of them, and we had high transaction volumes and they were on credit card. So what we did was instead we completely digitized those relationships. So we used the punch out function within Coupa, which means that there's a website that we can go to. But even on top of having the
And real quick,
website,
can you just define punch out a little bit more?
yeah, absolutely. So as a punch out is within Coupa, the functionality means that when you actually leave Coupa's platform and go to that supplier's website, you punch out to that supplier's website. So we would go into Coupa, you do your single sign-on login. It recognizes, I log in, hey, Vincent, you're in Coupa. I click a button and it takes me directly to Amazon's website, and I shop on Amazon like it's a regular experience. When I go to check out, it tells me pay by invoice, and then it routes me back into Coupa. And when I look at my shopping cart, I see all of the items that were in my Amazon cart. right? I add all of my billing, and then when I click submit, it gets routed through approvals. So the good thing on the punch out is that for suppliers that can maintain items for you and they already have items where the prices may change, you don't actually have to maintain a catalog of items and worry about keeping it up to date because all of that happens by the supplier, right? So that's one of the huge features there. And then from a like order management standpoint, it's a lot easier too. Like you have one thing, for example, Amazon gives you an order number. We use PO. We use the punch out. We get both of those things back, right? So I just got a credit memo yesterday for something, and it happened automatically. I didn't even have to do anything, right?
So it also helps kind of with your
Mhm.
reconciliation process too.
Yes, absolutely.
All
And
right,
then
Chris. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. Crystal?
Yes. A couple of questions from the audience. Vince, are you tracking your various budgets for different departments inside of Coupa?
that's a really good question. So we're entering our phase 2 of Coupa, where we're going to start implementing some of the additional benefits, and budgeting is one of the things that we're testing. So Coupa does allow you to, by cost center, have a budget, and it basically draws down on that budget as expenses are approved. So you can see how close you are to your budget. We just haven't implemented that yet, but we have it in our tested environment. We're working on it.
Wonderful, that's exciting.
Mhm.
And then last question kind of around change management. When you implemented Coupa, how did you get buy-in, and did you use like the train the trainer method? How did you cascade this down to all your users?
Yeah, so it's funny. I've done a bunch of ERP implementations, and at a school with teachers, this is something that you're gonna have to like teach, right? And it has to be like a robust plan. So what we actually did, we got the buy-in from the leadership. Just I think getting the vision to them was important, and understanding that we knew their current state and we were taking into consideration the teachers, right? Like how the teachers as well as the ops staffs, how this was going to affect them, what this was going to change for them. Once we got that buy-in from the leadership perspective, we did a couple of things. We actually did a pilot. First, we went to just our operations. We opened the system only to our operation staffs. Then we piloted certain schools, and then we went broader, right? And what that allowed us to do was we went to the local ops. They became an extension of our team. Then we trained them, right? And then we used them to do the trainer. So we did the trainer with the schools. So this way they could train the school personnel. And the pilot allowed us to see, one, that the system was working with all the different schools, but then two, see how our training was working from the trainer perspective, right? And we were able to gather feedback, make any modifications, and then do that broader with all of the schools. And I will say that, it was one of the smoothest ERP implementations I've ever seen, right? It was less than a year, which is mind-boggling to me still. And it was well received by the staff.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
And just to confirm, another question, you do have a centralized procurement process, right? That's what you're considering?
Yes. So yes, all of the purchasing goes through Coupa, right?
Perfect.
So as far as for like support for the team, we're still working on expanding that. But if you want to buy anything, it goes through Coupa.
Perfect.
Mhm.
And then last question, I believe I heard you say that you are using pay by invoice, but at one time you might have been using credit card. Can you expand on your form of payment with Amazon Business, and then briefly touch on your receiving procedures that you have in place?
Yep. Okay. So whenever making a decision on whether or not to use credit card, a lot of companies think about the amount of rebates that they're going to get back, right? And when we looked at from a financial perspective, every company's different, but we focused less on the rebates, and we wanted more of reducing and controlling our credit card spend, and thinking about terms and terms and data richness, right? So with invoices, you get a little bit more data on the back end. So we made the decision to move from credit cards to invoices for Amazon for that reason, for those reasons. And as far as for, sorry, I'm trying to remember the second part of your
The last part
question.
was receiving procedures. So once the goods come in, like how are you doing your invoice matching and all of that?
Yeah, so we do three-way match within our system. So the good thing about the punch out feature is the moment that you go through the cart, you get the approvals, it automatically generates POs. So the moment that a requisition is approved, it generates the PO and it sends it directly to the supplier. That happens in a couple of different ways, but for Amazon, we took it a step further and we wanted our communications to go electronically through what they call CXML, or it's basically like data transfer, right? Mm-hmm. So Amazon receives a PO. I actually ordered something the other day. I get an email right back within minutes that says Amazon received my order. Then Amazon has a lot of good notifications on, okay, well, your order has shipped. The moment that it ships, Amazon invoices us. So that invoice sits in Coupa, and in the moment that I actually receive the item, sorry, take a step back. So once we receive the invoice into Coupa, it triggers something, an email comes to me that says, you have something pending receipt, right? So the moment that I receive the item, I'll go back into Coupa or even my email or the app, receive the item, and then it's completed my three-way match. And then payment automatically goes to Amazon after that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And Vince, to confirm, you all pay with ACH to us, right?
Yes, ACH. So that's another good thing. And that was another big push we had to do because of the pandemic. We had to like really push for our suppliers to move to ACH for obvious reasons. Going into the office to cut checks was just going to be too complicated.
Excellent.
Wonderful. That's it for me for now.
All right, great.
Thanks, Crystal.
Right.
I wonder, Vince, if you could, there's two more points, like I want to get back to the kind of the savings portion that you noticed when you implemented this digital solution.
Yeah.
If you can speak a little bit more on that for a few minutes.
Yeah, I think first thing that always comes to mind for people when savings is like a reduced price, right? And of course, we'll see some of that, right? Where, you get visibility to, hey, we're buying multiple items and why did we ever pay that amount for that, right? Like it could be so much cheaper, right? So we get that. But even more importantly, we actually get to manage the demand, right? So a lot of stuff comes into Coupa. One thing came through the other day. I was like, wait, why are we buying this, right? And instead of buying it, we actually make a conversation, and now the need goes away, right? And that's what we've been seeing a lot of. I wanted a system that was very user friendly, but also gave me a lot of controls just in case I needed to step in and say, and make changes, right? And that's probably the bigger savings portion, right? Because think about it, even if you're saving, 5%, 10% on an item, the bigger savings is going to be not to buy the item, right? Right.
Absolutely correct on that one.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, what did you notice, if you can say, across your vendors, the drop in spend or the monetary savings that you noticed because of some of those controls now?
Yeah, so it's a little tough using this last year because of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But because some of the demand that went away, we know is going to come back. Mm-hmm. And we've seen spend shift to different areas. A lot of it, of course, spending to technology because of, just, being available for the pandemic. But I will say that we've seen on some of the items that we've purchased, we've been doing a better job of like certain areas, not just randomly buying different items. So for example, we had to buy webcams, right? there was a request for a webcam. It was like, wow, that's really nice. It's a 4K webcam. And then we see the price and it's like, it's pretty steep. In the past, that would have just been purchased, right? And no one would have seen, no. But what we were able to do is actually step in, go. We work with CDW a lot, and we were able to find something with CDW that was great. And actually, we did an RFP for it, and CDW came back with one of the best prices, and it was like a 4K camera. I'm actually on it right now, right? So, right, so it was a huge savings, right? Like I would say from a percentage standpoint, we probably saved like 30-40% from what we would have purchased, but that wouldn't have been possible without, like, I don't know, like some of that automation that we have in place.
So it even sounds like you're able, with this process and using Coupa, you're able to shift some things that have been traditionally tail spend, so after the thought and not planned, and actually being able to move those into a planned spend to help generate additional savings.
Yeah, there are some times where we're able to do that. I could tell you that it looks like procurement comes in as a bad cop, because if it's in Coupa, that means it's en route to be purchased. And then most of the time that's us stepping in and being like, hey, no, we should relook at this or look at this differently. If it's something big enough, I'll have someone on my team work with the stakeholder. So it's not as close to the beginning of the process as we would like, but it's at least a step. The next step to make it earlier in the process would be having categories set up, understanding what some of the needs are for the next year. And there are other categories that are very robust that we do that. Right.
Nice. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on, now we've got attendees from all different sized organizations. So some may at a freestanding charter school, some maybe at a network of 2 to 3, and then charter management, education management organizations within that small to large spectrum. If you were a smaller organization and to the cost to incorporate Coupa is a little cumbersome at this time, what are some of your recommendations?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we actually looked at, when we competed for Coupa, we looked at a couple of different systems. There are actually some P2P systems that are free to education and it depends on the scope that you're trying to do within the system. So that's one option. Another option is to partner with suppliers that can actually become an extension and help build out some of that. I know one of the things that, we use some of Amazon's capabilities, but we know that there's a lot more. For example, within Amazon, that you could actually set up businesses with profiles and then have like locations and do your approvals and your routing all within Amazon. Like, we know that that's a possibility. We just have Coupa, so we don't have to, right? But I do think that that's a nice option for someone that's a small business. Another thing that I would suggest is partnering with group purchasing organizations. There is a GPO for charter schools. The name of it slips my mind, but that's a really good way where you are one individual school, your spend gets combined with other schools, so you can get significant pricing discounts. And then lastly, but this is probably one of the most important ones, your state may actually have state contracts with suppliers where you don't actually have to do negotiations. We participate in a bunch of state contracts as well. I'm telling you, it's gold. Like, you think about it, any of the systems that you're probably trying to use, you could probably reach out to a supplier, ask them if they have a state contract, and you're probably like 80% of the way there. Like, so those are some of the things that I would suggest. But I mean, even for some of these small charter schools and things, if they have questions, I told you, Morgan, I will make myself available if anyone wants to, pick my brain or anything afterwards. But the idea is, use the resources around you. Don't feel like you have to take everything on yourself.
Excellent. And I think the one organization you were referring to for charter schools was BuyQ, and it's BUYQ.
Okay.
If you are, they are specifically focused for charter schools. And a lot of the features Vince has talked about in terms of budget management, that functionality within Coupa. Amazon Business has released product updates since you all integrated with Coupa about 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years in I think December of this year, where you can use the approval workflow. You can set up your budgets so that way your users are staying within the means of the organization. And we have a whole team. If you have questions about how to set up your account and activate those features, in our follow-up email, if you, myself, Matt, and Crystal are the main contacts for charter schools. But if you don't know who to reach out to, we'll be providing, the NAPCS will be providing in the recap email an email address that you can write to find out who your advisor is on our side. And it looks like Crystal's got a few questions.
Yeah, I have one last question so far. Question comes from the audience. If wanting to know if Success has any policies around shopping diverse, such as small and minority-owned businesses, and if so, how are you managing that within your digital procurement processes?
Yeah, no. So that's a good question. So right now we don't have a formalized supply diversity program. That is something that is on my roadmap. That I'm actually. It's funny, if you look on LinkedIn, you'll see I'm hiring someone and it's right in their job description, right? So this is something that, of course, is near and dear, that we want to go after. For right now, what we do is we identify who our small business suppliers are, and we use a system that basically uses their tax IDs, gathers information about supplier risk and everything, but also helps identify what their classification is. And what we try to do is, when we have specific initiatives, we try to make sure that we target diverse suppliers when possible. I actually had a conversation with one person on my team today about something. I was like, hey, can we just target some small business suppliers for this? And so, that's the way that we do it now, but the plan is to build out a diversity program.
Excellent. And just for everyone on the call, you can configure your Amazon Business account. Vince and I, if you don't mind me sharing, we worked on an initiative with he and his team last fall on a recognition gift for the operations professionals, and we were able to secure a product that was sourced A, locally from New York City, and B, that was a certified small business. And so you have the ability, if you are shopping on Amazon Business now, to use our diverse sellers policy to enable minority-owned businesses, LGBT businesses, and other small business designations that will start surfacing those products and sellers to the top of the page. Crystal, do you have any other questions so far?
No more questions at this time.
Well, we've got a few more minutes here. Vince, is there any remarks or
there was actually one thing I just want to expand off of, like the relationship with Amazon. This is something that we haven't rolled out yet, but I would be remiss without mentioning it. So the pandemic just caused a huge issue just with, like, how do you deliver items, right? So two things with Amazon that I actually want to publicly thank you for, right? But the first is the fact that you just make shipping to homes easy, right? So we actually had some suppliers where we actually had to work to transition them there. Some that we had to do additional steps in the process. But with things like the art kits, right? I think we bought like thousands. I don't want to probably say the number, but I know it was thousands, right?
It was a good chunk. I remember
right.
that one.
Right. And one of the benefits was that we were able to take advantage of your supply chain to be able to ship. One of the additional cost savings that I didn't mention earlier is the reduced shipping or no shipping charges with Amazon Prime. And I think that companies don't realize how complicated it is, especially as a school. We didn't realize it because our last mile never happened. Our last mile was you send it to a school and they hand it out to a scout, right? But it's that last mile requires a lot of resources and a lot of customer service that most companies don't have, right? So when you're shipping, we had another thing that we shipped last year where we had to take it on ourselves, send it to a warehouse, ship it out to the individual families. What happens with when it's lost, right? Like somebody on our team has to go and track every device, like everything that we ship out. Whereas, I think you lost me.
Oh, we've got you now.
Yeah, there we go.
Hear you. There we go.
All right, don't know what happened, but
There was a little blip there, huh?
right. But that's me getting censored. Somebody didn't like what I was saying. But like that, I think that's a huge benefit that a lot of companies don't really understand until you are knee deep in the midst of it and you have to do it, right? And then the next thing, which we haven't rolled out yet, that I'm find really interesting, is the opportunity to use SSO with Amazon. So we already use it on our Amazon business side, but we were going to be innovative and use it on our scholar side, right? Where all of our scholars, we use Google Chrome management, everything. So being able to connect that through SSO now allows us to do things. It gives us the opportunity to do things like send them Kindle books, right? And being able to make sure that it goes directly to them instead of having to have an Excel that someone manages and hands out an individual code and all of that, right? Another example, which we were considering, given that, who knows what next year looks like if we're going to be back in schools 100%. But what if a scholar needs materials like pens, pencils, protractors, and things like that? This would now be an opportunity where we could be very controlled and say, this scholar has a $10 budget and they can get these specific items and that's it, right? And that would then ship directly to their home. And now we don't have to have our local operations team putting together a little kit of items and shipping it via UPS or something like that. It can be automated and it can be based off of the needs of an individual instead of having to do mass like distributions, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, it also, the great work that charter schools like yours does in servicing populations that tend to be disenfranchised, this gives you the opportunity to help that scholar out who may have insecure housing or may travel between relatives and where they live. They can get the product where they are at that time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I notice, every company has like different goals that will affect procurement. And one of the things that I try to keep in mind is that we have a lot of scholars that, are, like you mentioned, disenfranchised. We also have teachers, and I want to make sure that our teachers have the items that they need when they need it, right? Like, I mean, I've heard all the stories about teachers having to go into their own pockets to try and buy stuff and things like that. And, anything that we can do to make sure that that doesn't have to happen, and that they have it at that moment that they need it, that's what my team is trying to focus on.
Excellent. Well, Vince, thanks for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll take it and then be able to follow up with you. And then also, we will be, Vince, as long as you're okay with this as well, in our recap email, we'll go ahead and share your contact information, your email address. So if you have additional questions or would like to brainstorm with Vince, he is more than happy to hop on a call with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can also share my LinkedIn. I can send that over to you. So this way, feel free to reach out. I already connect with a lot of other charter schools here in the city. And just remember that even as complicated as it may get, you're doing a huge service, right? And you're literally shaping the future. So, just, I don't know, take an extra sip of your strong coffee and let's just try to tough it out and educate some scholars.
Excellent. Thanks, Vince. I'll kick it over to you, Cindy, for wrap up.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you, Vincent, for a great conversation. And thank you all for joining us today. We will share the recording of today's webinar via email. And don't forget to visit our website, www.publiccharters.org/webinars, where we have recordings from past webinars and information on upcoming webinars. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.